Hi again then guys, and welcome to another retro review from the world of Forza, from Motorsport 3 in particular, and this one, as you saw from the title and of course from the thumb, is a 3-in-1 special. There wasn't really a good enough reason to feature each of these three cars in its own review because they are just so similar. There is one significant difference on the spec side of things though between the three cars, and we'll get to that in just a second. Now of course the cars in question are Corvettes, C5 generation, they are clearly race cars of course, but not necessarily a class of racing that many of you will be familiar with. They're not GT3s, they're not GT2s, certainly not GT1s, they're actually something called speed GT cars. Much like another very curious and unique race car in Forza, and one of my preferred race cars actually for how different it was, the Volvo. The Volvo S60 with all-wheel drive and the two-tone paint, that competed in this same series as well. Now, the fact that you can have something so different in the same class, a Corvette with rear-wheel drive, a Volvo with all-wheel drive, I love that. That immediately endears me to the idea of this series, and it reminds me a little bit of like the SCCA stuff back in the day with like a C5 Corvette race car, the kind of thing that you'd see in Gran Turismo for instance. And one of the things that I love about Forza, in a similar way to especially the older Gran Turismo games, is actually the fact that they bother to feature cars like this at all. You don't, strictly speaking, need these cars in the game. You could make an argument for the Volvo because it's a significant car for the brand, it allows you to race with a proper Volvo competition machine, but when it comes to Corvettes, well, a C5R surely is more than enough. A C6R on top of that, well, you've covered all the bases at the time. These weren't necessary cars, and yet they're still in the game. And I really like that. This kind of shout out and tribute to smaller, less known racing series and teams, in a similar way to, for instance, what Gran Turismo 2 did by having the Vauxhall Tigra Ice race car featured, the Trofei Andros vehicle, which is one of the only, if not the only game I've seen to have one of those cars in it. For many of us though who did play Forza 3 and maybe even the older games as well, which also featured these cars, you'd probably choose whichever one you like the look of the most. It's a fairly obvious route to take because you can see the specs are so similar. All three cars are 200,000 credits, so they're not that expensive either. They've all got a 5.8 litre, 525 horsepower V8, same torque, 470 pound-feet, and even the weight is exactly the same on all three cars at 1,338 kilos. So surely it makes no difference which one you choose. If they're all exactly the same across the board, then it's kind of like Formula to some degree, where all of these open wheel cars are basically just all different colours with different sponsors, but they don't necessarily feel that different. Well, that's the curious thing, because for whatever reason, they actually did decide to make the cars different in terms of the PI points. All three of them are different. In fact, the one that many of us would probably choose based on the looks, the Tiger Racing version, that one's actually the lowest, classed at 711. Then the 3R Racing version is 712 PI, and then the top of the three is the Whelen Racing at 713. So 711, 712, 713. Pretty clear difference between the three cars, and I'm not exactly sure why, because after driving them, they pretty much feel the same. And in real life, of course, that makes all kinds of sense. You don't want one car, for instance, running away with the lead all the time, so that's the whole point of the rules and regulations. But with that being the case, why they have three different PI point levels is kind of curious to me, because having driven all three, they really don't feel any different. You can kind of psychosomatically trick yourself into believing that one of them might handle differently, but let's be honest, there's not a huge difference between them. There are some visual differences, such as the wheels being different. You know, the livery, for instance, wouldn't make any difference to performance, but wheels could. But even then, the weight is the same anyway. So with all of that under consideration, what would my advice be? Which one should you actually buy? Well, you'd probably be thinking that logically, if they're all the same, but one is clearly given preference by the game, being the highest PI of the three, well, if they're all the same price, surely you should go for that one. Curiously though, I would actually give you the exact opposite advice 9 times out of 10. And the reason why I say 9 times out of 10 is because the one circumstance in which that highest PI car is better is if you plan to completely race stock. Because if you're racing them all stock, then of course, give yourself that little bit of an advantage for whatever reason. You probably won't feel any difference in the race, but why not? You know, it's just a for the sake of it kind of thing. On the other hand, the reason why I would recommend going for actually the Tiger racing version, which is the lowest of the three, is fairly logically simple once you think about it. If the car has the same performance, the same price, the same spec, but at a lower PI level, well, that gives you an advantage, because that potentially means that you can tune the car to a higher level than the other two without sacrificing the category or the PI level. So in other words, you could get a little bit less weight or a little bit more power out of the car without having it a higher PI point level, because it's already at a 2-point disadvantage. Now that might not work out that way, because there's not a huge amount that you can do to the cars anyway, but it is something to bear in mind. But what then about the grand scheme of things? Because many people in Forza, especially in the older games, of course do not take the Gran Turismo approach of racing, you know, like for like. There's no Group 3, Group 2, Group 1 kind of stuff like Gran Turismo has nowadays. This was very much like the old school Gran Turismo scene, where it's a pretty much free-for-all. You have GT3s and GT1s and track-only hypercars all going against each other, so under those circumstances, are these cars actually good at all? Should you get, for instance, something like the Volvo instead, or something completely different? Just go for a Corvette C5R, for example. I mean, it's famous for a reason, it's a great car, or even a C6R. Well, an argument of course can be made for those, because they are legendary, far more legendary than these, more powerful, and they are quicker, but I would say that for the right particular use, maybe a specific PI level, these can come into play. Are any of these three better than another Corvette race car like a C5R? Absolutely not, categorically not, and no matter what you do to them with tuning, they are never better than a C5 or a C6R. So I would say that this is the exact kind of car for somebody like me, and anyone like me, somebody who just likes to drive something different for the sake of it, or, more importantly, to give yourself a challenge. If you want to deliberately drive something that you still love, such as a Corvette, but give yourself a bit more of a challenge, something that requires more effort maybe to win against a C5R, well, that is the kind of thing where these cars can be useful for. In real life, of course, that's not the case, because they're specifically for this one racing class, but in the game, it's a free-for-all. So sure, you can use them if you want to. They certainly do offer a lot. The handling is smooth, the performance is good. It basically feels like the GT3 RS of Corvettes. That's literally what this car feels like. The power is not ridiculously high, the weight is still reasonable, and it feels for the most part like a modified Z06, which is essentially what it is. It's not this ground-up monster like a GT1. It is a semi-production kind of looking car and has appropriate handling. It's a Corvette with more grip, more downforce, closer ratio gears, and better cornering. If that sounds like it appeals to you for 200 grand, then sure, go for it. And at the end of the day, apart from the PI level thing, just choose whichever one you like the look of the most. So that's it for this particular installment. Of course, I will see you guys next time, and if you are new to the channel and want to check out my other Forza reviews, of course click on the playlist for Motorsport 3, but I've done pretty much cars in all of the other games as well, if you want to check out those also. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.